Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Tuesday, March 17th, 2026, and today we've got a little hybrid compilation episode with some new content and some original content. I mean, I guess all of it is original content technically, but anyway, today we're talking potting up. We're going to hear a little bit from composter Nathan Rutz and talk about proper usage of the Broadfork. So let's do it. All right, everyone, welcome to Till Tuesday, your weekly reminder that you can get living soil, compost, and potting mixes from the bona fide nerds at Tilth Soil. Check out Nathan on the Composter podcast, season 4, episode 3, or head to tillsoil.com to learn more, or also stick around here because we're going to revisit a conversation I had with Nathan for this show a while back. Anyway, my voice is continuing to gain strength every day, and I'm not going to do full-on episodes yet, but I thought I would try at least one segment today. I have so many things to talk about. I mean, it's spring, so things are springing, and I've been doing a lot since I last updated you all, and so why not give it a whirl today to try at least one segment? It's like 20 degrees outside here right now, and we're looking at some pretty nasty cold tonight and tomorrow, which, albeit inconvenient as I'm going to have to bring in some stuff inside, is not super uncommon for this time of year, but it is not even supposed to really get above freezing today, which hot crops really adore that. They do. They love that. So cheers to everyone who, like ourselves, have house guests this March. Oh, don't forget to sign up for the bracket challenge. You have until Thursday, I think. Thursday? Yeah, that's when games start. Usually around noon-ish. So try and do it before then. And also, don't forget to send in your 20-second farm video clips to farmermike@no-tillgrowers.com. Love seeing those. I had originally planned to go live this week, but with my voice the way it is, talking for 20 minutes is fine. Talking for an hour is quite a chore. So I'm thinking we will save that for next week if possible and continue on these sort of hybrid episodes for the next few days. Anyway, yes. So this week I was potting up some of our tomatoes and peppers, and I thought I would talk a bit about this process because we covered it a little bit yesterday in the tomatoes episode, but I think there are a few things to think about. First, potting up, sometimes called potting on, is when you take a smaller plant and put it into a larger pot or block to extend its life in the greenhouse. Now, why would somebody bother with this and not just, start the plant, say a tomato or pepper crop, closer to the time that they need to plant? Well, the answer is simply that if you want the largest plant possible by the time that you actually put it in the ground, potting up extends the plant's ability to get bigger in the greenhouse. Why would you not just, start with the plant in a bigger block or container to begin with? Just start a big block and then put a little seed in it? Well, one, smaller plants take up less space. So during a colder time of year, smaller blocks means less heating or moving the plants in at night. So you don't have 10 big trays. You just have one tray with a bunch of small blocks on it to deal with if you need to move them around. Also, as you water blocks or cells, no matter what they are, you slowly lose some of the nutrients in the blocks themselves through leaching. So a larger block or pot means you'd, be losing nutrients through the entire life of the block. In potting up, you get a fresh burst of goodness for the plant instead of just letting it grow into that old stale block. Now, in terms of actually doing this, we use soil balls and or a 4-inch soil block maker, which has its own large 2-inch dibbler that will, leave you room in the block itself to put the smaller block into, which is nice. You can also use pots, just those little round pots or square pots that you see. We don't use pots because, we like our soil blocks, but, they grow great transplants, but also to avoid root wrapping, which can lead to transplant shock. But pots work fine. No shame in, using a pot versus a soil block, especially or preferably if you can reuse the pots. Now, a couple things. In general, with soil blocks, you don't want to plop the young transplants into cold soil blocks or soil mix if you can. This is less of a concern with pots because you're, typically using a dry mix there. But with soil blocks, you have this wet mix that can get really cold. So preferably you make all the blocks at once, let them warm up for a little bit in the greenhouse. It takes 30 minutes or something. And then you transplant. That just skips that transplant shock. You just definitely don't want those roots going into cold soil blocks in the same way that you don't want the roots going into cold soil later when you put them in the garden. And of course, just a reminder with grafted plants, if you're doing that whole grafting thing, the graft can't go below the soil mix. It has to stay well above it. Otherwise, the scion will root into the soil. I don't do soil balls with grafted tomatoes for that reason, just because it's really, really hard to keep the soil off of the scion. All bets are off though for all the other tomato plants. And you can easily even flip the plant over so that the stems are actually touching the soil block. If you want, that can give them more stability and it allows them to kind of root out of the stem. Just be careful not to break the plant when you do that. Now, I will often pot my peppers into soil balls, and that's usually when I'm trying to conserve soil mix. But also, if you don't have a soil block maker, you can just use the soil mix and form a ball around your young transplants, or a cube or a trapezoid or whatever shape you're after. A trapezoid would be impressive. That would be cool. The soil balls work fine, but they can get a little dry easier than the soil blocks cans or like cells or pots or whatever. So I prefer to bottom water the soil balls for sure. There's nothing really special to that. Make them as big as you want. And if you need to, you can add more soil mix later on, if they're kind of outgrowing their soil balls. And that's just kind of the gist. Note that when you're potting up is when labeling can get a little wacky. So make sure to take your time and label the plants properly as you go. It can be a little time consuming. It'll pay off in the end when you're like, is this a cherry tomato, heirloom tomato? It's nice to know the difference. And I think that's it for potting up for now. Let me know your questions. Otherwise, we're going to take a quick break. And then we're going to join Old Me to talk about prim and proper broad forking. That should be fun. BRB.
Hey guys. I know this looks a little crazy. I literally just finished setting up this drip tape. Obviously, I'm going to have to pull it back to deal with cover crops later, but super stoked about it. Just wanted to give a shout out to Sarah over at DripWorks. She was, I think in customer service, very helpful. Basically, she saw my order come through, and the woman hunted me down despite my best efforts to evade what I thought was a spam call. She found me and was like, hey, I think I see your vision. I think you're going to want to swap out these pieces. So really appreciate her help.
Today's episode is brought to you by Grown By. Grow smarter with Grown By, the farmer-owned cooperative. Grown By is the platform for online sales of everything: custom and traditional CSAs, halves of beef, flower bouquets, wholesale to restaurants, and now Grown By supports in-person sales too. With their new app, Grown By Register, you can supercharge your market and farm stand, finally bringing together your online and offline sales and customer data. Grown By is proud to make local food accessible by processing SNAP benefits online and in person right within the app. Grown By helps you to put your best food forward. Schedule a demo today at coop.grownby.com/no-till. That's coop.grownby.com/no-till. All right, back to the show.
Today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Bill Marshall, who writes, quote, Farmer Jesse, would you speak in more detail about broad forking? Thanks to your videos, I bought one for my 1,200 square foot home garden, all beds of which are just a few years old. I'm in Western PA, Zone 6A, yellow clay. That was a fun little rhyme there, Bill. How often do you broad fork your existing beds? What time of year and what indicators do you use to decide that compaction is sufficiently reduced and you can stop broad forking a bed? Thank you, and end quote. All right, great questions here, Bill. So first, for those of you not watching on YouTube or those of you who do not yet own your own broad fork, there are ways to use this tool well and ways to needlessly overemploy it, thus wasting a bunch of your time. I'm going to attempt to point you in the direction of the former. First, for the uninitiated, a broad fork looks like a giant dinner fork on two sticks, with generally 4 to 6 long tines on the bottom, a bar that connects them all, and then 2 handlebars to hold on to as you pull it back. And as a tool, its purpose is to decompact and aerate the soil. Specifically on a small scale, on a large scale, a subsoiler, or typically something to that extent, is used for the same purpose. And it's intended to do so without destroying too much of the soil structure or by crushing soil aggregates in the way that a tiller or rotary plow or spader or whatever can, which you don't want to do because that effectively releases a lot of the soil organic matter in your soil. So what the broad fork looks like in practice is that you are pushing the broad fork deep into the soil, pulling back lightly to just pop the soil up a bit, and then stepping back roughly a foot or so, and then repeating the process all the way down the bed. This process allows some soil organic matter, like compost, to slip deep into the soil horizons, which can help break apart compaction and get nutrients deep into the soil. Broad forking can help just break apart hard pans that are deep in there from tractors or animals or humans or lack of plant roots or standing water, etc. Will it break apart some good guy fungal hyphae in the process? Sure, but it won't pulverize the soil, and ultimately, if you do it right, it will lead to healthier soil. And as I often say, it's a tool that should, if used right, put itself out of business on your farm, make itself effectively obsolete. So how do I use it? Well, And remember, I'm on heavy clay. In the spring, as I get a bed ready to plant, I use a piece of rebar to push it into the soil to see if that particular bed is compacted. If the rebar slides smoothly into the soil down to about 14 to 18 or so inches, that bed is good to go. No more need to Broadfork. If it does not go that deep, or at least not with ease of me just pushing my body weight down on the rebar, then I Broadfork. Before I do, most of the time I will add a little compost to the surface so that as I Broadfork, the compost will drop down into the cracks. Typically, this Broadforking is done in the spring, but kind of in those mildly drier spells, which we have not had a ton of this year. But you want to do it when the soil is not so wet that it's mucky or that the Broadfork just slides through, like trying to Broadfork a thick milkshake. Now, once a year is generally fine. In really compacted soils, maybe twice that first year, once between each of the first two crops in that bed, that won't be a bad idea. Then just as needed from then on. I will say I found a couple of spots in our garden this year that were mostly fine last year, but seemed a little more compacted this year, or at least that's what it felt like. Why were they suddenly compacted again? I'm honestly not sure, though. The hard ice freeze we had in January killed some of the cover crops I'd planted there, or I'd planned to have there. So maybe that was had something to do with it, or perhaps I've changed my tolerance for compaction, or maybe I just didn't grow enough crops in those areas last year. Also, you cannot check for compaction in clay when the soil is too wet because it will give you a false reading because it's easier to poke through wet clay than moist clay with rebar. So the moisture last year may have had something to do with it. Hard to say. But I checked those spots like normal and Broadforked them in hopes that I won't have to do that again, or at least not for a while. Like everything in farming, just don't go at it dogmatically. Like, this is what I want my soil practices to be, and so I'm not going to do X and I am going to do Y or whatever. Instead, just ask the soil what it needs at that moment and give it that, which may indeed be a Broadforking. Bill also asked about indicators, and beyond compaction, just crop performance, especially cover crops, because they can be great indicators of poor soil health. If they're short and or yellow and not vigorous, that makes me think that bed could use a little assistance from the Broadfork for the subsequent crop, at least, and if not, maybe some compost or something for nitrogen. I have also Broadforked the cover crops in situ, like Broadfork them when they are a few inches tall, but haven't yet noticed or recorded any meaningful changes from that. Anyway, I hope that helps a bit.
Hey there, hope you're having a good season start. I've got a bunch of broccoli as well as some leeks and onions here in the back room, and things are growing right along. I'm at Robert's Roots Organic Farm in Langley, BC, Canada, under the lights. Happy gardening, everyone.
Today's episode is brought to you by Good Agriculture. If you'd rather be on the farm than inside doing your taxes, you are not alone. Good Agriculture handles farm bookkeeping and tax filing, so there is no scrambling at tax time. They keep your books clean and up to date and show you where your farm's finances stand. If you're behind, they'll get you caught up. They also help farmers find funding and stay ahead of grant deadlines. You run the farm, they help the business. Learn more at goodagriculture.com/info. That's goodagriculture.com/info. All right, back to the show.
All right, so we had a Patreon question come in, Nathan, that it was, I think at this point, a few months back, but that was from Patreon member Kyle Putnam, and Kyle Putnam just wrote, peat plus tariffs. So in the composting world, are there things, and it could be peat or it could be other things, that tariffs have interrupted for you all yet, or that you can foresee?
Mostly we've been made nervous about tariffs more than actually had them impact us. So the nervousness has been around peat, especially because in our potting soil we do use peat. Happy to go on a nice long digression about peat someday. The Canadian Magnum Peat Association managed to hold off tariffs on peat to the U.S., so nobody's paying tariffs on peat from Canada to the U.S. Maybe from other countries. There is some, I know there's like peat brought in from Latvia occasionally and the Baltic states, but Canadian peat, there's no tariffs on it currently. One issue, there is a fair amount of international trade in composting equipment. That's really on the larger scale, like where we want to get to. So a lot of that stuff may be tariffed, but we haven't run into that specifically yet.
I'm kind of curious if you would kind of talk a little bit about peat, because this is something that comes up when we talk about potting soils, when we talk about sustainability and those sort of things. Like, as a company who uses this product, like, how do you all think about this or talk about it?
So we think about peat frequently. and where it comes from and what it is and the scale of its extraction. And so right now, why do we use peat? We use peat because there's nothing else like it. There is no replacement for peat currently. So what does peat have going for it? If you want to use compost in a potting soil, compost is generally neutral or a little bit basic. So you need something that's going to balance it on a pH, on an acidity scale, and peat moss does that. Also in potting mix, you want it to be loose and light, but you also want it to hold water. Peat also does that. You also want it to not cost $1 zillion. Peat also does that. So you have the acidity, you have the physical properties that a good quality peat has that is really desirable in a potting soil. You have a price, you have a well-developed market that exists. You also don't want it to be horrific for the environment. Another consideration for potting soil is you also don't want it to have a nitrogen draw. So there are some products that suck that are, because they're fresher carbon, they're not pickled like peat is, like wood fiber products are a really cool thing that I'm interested in using and playing with, particularly maybe for replacing perlite, but those do have some nitrogen draw, and so that then increases the amount of additional nitrogen that you have to put in your potting mix to balance that out. So the sustainability of peat is an important topic and one to not shy away from as a potting soil maker. So in most of the criticism of the use of peat comes from the British Islands, where peat has been over-harvested for over 1,000 years, largely for power, for heat. And so there are actually still, as I understand it, a few peat-burning power plants. So the amount of peat being sucked up for energy is way more than is used in horticulture. But so if you're in, if you're in the British Islands or you're in Western Europe, where most of the peat has been depleted by civilization over the last 2,000 years, yes, I get it. You're like, yes, using more peat seems like a bad idea. In Canada, my best understanding is that the peatlands of Canada are incredibly vast, and that 0.03% or so of the peatlands of Canada are harvested for horticultural use. There's a good paper on this by James Altland from the USDA about peat moss, where he really looked into the various different aspects of the peat harvest and explains it pretty thoroughly. Peat moss does grow. It grows very slowly. According to Dr. Altland, the replacement rate of peat outpaces in Canada, like naturally, without even replanting the drained bogs. There is more peat accumulating in Canada than is harvested for horticultural use. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be circumspect about it, but that is something worth noting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a tough subject because it takes forever for it to regenerate, and it's also a really good sequestration of carbon. So there is a little bit of that. The other uses that you talked about, like energy usage, I know that it's used often in like filtration and other aspects. Those things are a little bit more concerning to me than horticultural use, just because it goes from being in the ground to going back in the ground. And you do use, like in the case of a soil mix, and I know you are losing carbon along the way, but you're at least, and you're using carbon to extract it, but you are at least like replacing some percentage of it in a different area.
Yeah.
I don't want to feel like I justify it that way, but that is often how I think about it, at least in terms of horticulture.
I mean, for us, we live in the world that exists today. We don't get to live in the world that the solar punk utopia that I wish existed right now.
That we're working towards, right?
We're working towards it. Yes, that's what this like. Yes, another world is necessary. I feel like saying, "Oh, you can't use peat," is kind of like, "Oh, if you care about the environment, are you driving your car to the farmer's market?" Just the like endless litany of like, yes, there's yes, we live in the world as it is. If you look at the so-called alternatives, they're actually often worse in a lot of regards.
I do think that gets overlooked. I think you and I have maybe talked about just, the extraction of coconut coir from places that are low in minerals and carbon already. Taking that product out of those areas in large quantities can be detrimental to those environments as well. So, like, there is a little bit of that also.
Yes. And there's even, like, if you're looking at pine bark or wood fiber, all that stuff is from the excesses of the U.S. construction industry and southern yellow pine plantations. And so all those alternatives, yes, those are sort of waste products. They're like the marginal southern yellow pine, which is actually not a type of pine. It's mostly loblolly pine is the more specific species. But the southern yellow pine industry in the United States plants giant, humongous monocultures, and they're conventionally farmed. And so we have this marginalia from the stuff that can't be used for construction that can be used for wood fiber products or pine bark products. And is that better? You got to do some real deep system dynamics stuff that I don't think anybody's done. So I just have to wave my hands a little bit and be like, what do I think about this? So the peat industry to me seems, it doesn't seem any worse. It's hard for me to see how it's worse than the southern yellow pine industry. All that said, the dream would be compost as whole media. Can we make potting soil that's just compost?
Can we?
The short answer is absolutely, but will it behave exactly the same way? And that answer is no. So you can't, with the right combination of stuff in your compost, with really nice, if you've got nice horse manure and you've got nice, your feedstocks are always going to, composting reduces the amount of nitrogen. There's a maximum concentration of nitrogen that can exist in a compost because the mostly bacteria and the fungi will basically burp and fart and poop it out if there's a higher concentration than they can actually incorporate into their bodies. And sometimes it's nice to have a little extra around in the system for young plants to go boom. So that's the thing. How is your nitrogen stored? How much is it in the necromass, which is the dead bodies of the crobes? And how much is actively being cycled? And how much is like bound to other things? So, but the dream being a potting soil or a seedling media that is compost, maybe it's some biochar, and maybe we're doing weird things like planting cover crops in windrows of compost with different root architectures that once we terminate those cover crops, then we leave the roots in and somehow we shred the mix just right to preserve that porosity, and we use it within 6 months or 3 months or something so that the roots haven't fully decomposed, so you have some of that loft. So anyway, that's the solar punk utopia version of potting soil.
I like it. I think that I hope to see you all trialing some of these things because I'd be down to trial them with you if you want me to try some veggies on them.
I do. I tried a teeny weeny just like playing with it last year, and I haven't. We're not at a place to be able to really trial this at any kind of reasonable scale, but that is coming soon with the new site.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that episode. Really appreciate your patience on the voice, as always. It is getting better. It feels great. Just doesn't sound quite there yet. Thank you all. Don't forget, No Till Growers is a nonprofit 501c3, so donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. Please make sure to like and subscribe and or follow wherever you're getting this podcast. That's an easy way to help us out as well. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors. And if you'd ever like to sponsor the show, you can reach out to Farmer Michelle at notillgrowers.com. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music, Mike Hilbert for the production help and editing, and also my wife Hannah for absolutely everything in the world. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. Cheers. Pick up a hat or a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook, at notillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/notillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you sign up in the month of March. But we're going to hold off on shout outs until I can do a full episode and do a full story. So stay tuned for that. And thank you all so much. Much love. See you tomorrow. Bye.